What are the implications of the crisis of American democracy, or even a more successful coup attempt, for the rest of us? With a few important exceptions, there's actually very little written in Australia, internationally, and even in the United States on this what if question. Much of the American commentary is focused on the immediate ramifications of the insurrection, asking what might have happened if the mob had caught someone like Speaker Nancy Pelosi, or if they had managed to delay the certification of the election result. There's very little on what might have happened next, how the Pentagon might have responded, if the military might have intervened, or how the outgoing president, Donald Trump, might have reacted to a different outcome on the Capitol that day. I think pondering these questions does kind of feel, to be fair, like we might be straying into the realm of speculative fiction, into like an even more embarrassing version of The Handmaid's Tale. To quote Fintan O'Toole, this risks repeating the comforting fiction that the United States used to be a glorious and settled democracy, and prevents any reckoning with the fact that its current crisis is not a terrible departure from the past, but rather a product of the unresolved contradictions of American history. But that doesn't mean that speculation based on evidence and an understanding of American history cannot or should not be done. There has been some thinking about the impact that the collapse of American democracy might have on the rest of the world. And this kind of analysis is pretty familiar to historians of American foreign policy. Mostly it's hand-wringing about the blow to American credibility and this kind of deep-seated, particularly American fear that the shining light on the hill, the beacon to the world and the guidepost for the aspiring Democrats the world over, might be snuffed out. In the mainstream media, at least, there doesn't appear to be much speculation about the real-world impact of such a snuffing out. In Australia, there is some important thinking happening about what a Trump redux might mean for the rest of us. In the Lowy Institute's The Interpreter, for example, both Grant Wyatt and Bent Scott have attempted to answer the question. Scott outlined the links between Trumpian conspiracy theories about the deep state and American conservatives' broader fixation on Australian COVID policy responses. He argued that Trump's return might mean a more aggressive meddling in democracies like Australia, alongside further efforts to strengthen and empower far-right networks internationally. And the links between far-right networks and leaders in countries like the United States, Brazil and Hungary really bear this argument out. Wyeth has also argued, correctly, I think, that although no one in any official position will say it openly, maintenance of the two countries' shared values now relies on the Democratic Party being in power. This work does suggest that discussions about the alliance in Australia is broadening, as many have long called for. But these interventions tend still to focus very much on the international arena, what the implications of a Trump return might be for the alliance, for Australia's national security in the context of US-China relations, and for what the United States might be doing in the Indo-Pacific. They are, after all, writing about foreign affairs. But Australia's relationship with the United States has actually a significant physical and material presence on Australian domestic soil. So to stray again into speculation, as any good foreign policy has to do in planning for the future, it's worth considering what a successful insurrection might have meant for Australia. Australia invests eye-watering amounts of money in defence contracts with the US government and with private arms providers. What might happen to those contracts if there was a cataclysmic collapse in relations between the White House and the Pentagon? What could be the impact on the global economy? On January 6 in 2021, the insurrectionist mob went after Vice President Mike Pence. You might recall the footage, in fact, of Vice President Mike Pence running down the corridor away from the mob, and that mob missing him by a matter of seconds. What might have happened if the mob, as they tried very hard to do, had caught up with Vice President Mike Pence, for whom there was a literal gallows waiting outside? What got lost in all of that is that everywhere the Vice President of the United States goes, he is followed by a Secret Service agent carrying a backup nuclear football That's a backup version of the big red button, the big red nuclear button that the president has following him around at all times. As Pence was fleeing the mob, he and that Secret Service agent were separated. And in fact, the Secret Service lost track of that backup nuclear football for a significant amount of time. And to make it even worse, they didn't know they'd lost track of the backup nuclear football until months later when it was revealed in a congressional investigation. If that had gone differently, what would such a colossal security breach mean for Australia, given our nation's deep integration into US military structures? Or to take another example, what if a hostile foreign government got access to highly classified documents about the AUKUS submarine agreement and nuclear integration because the president had removed them illegally from the White House? And to take these questions even further, how might an Australian government respond if, to use the words of President Joe Biden, semi-fascists were suddenly in charge of the greatest military power in the world? Who would those 2,000 American Marines on rotation in Darwin answer to? How would they respond to events at home? What would we do if our best friend in the world, our great protector, descended into a violent fascist dictatorship? These are extreme hypotheticals. But 3 years ago, we were really close to having to respond to them in the real world. And the danger of that happening again is also real. Trump and the unresolved contradictions of American history have hardly gone away. And if they manage to come roaring back to power, they will turn the alliance on its head. The question might be then not the usual, what if they abandon us? But what if they don't? There is no question that the current government would respond to a Trump or a Trump-like administration, or even another attempted insurrection, successful or otherwise, very differently to the previous Australian government. What is not clear, at least from the outside, is how it might be able to respond to such events or where the red lines would be. Australia is well practiced at establishing diplomatic relationships with non-democratic governments, something that is essential to the maintenance of regional and global stability and security. But it is uncertain how such a relationship might be built with a dramatically different United States. Would a Labor government, or any government really, be able to extract Australia from arrangements like forced posture or Pine Gap? Or to ask a much more uncomfortable question, is it possible that it might decide not to try? That it might make the decision that Australia should always rely on a US security blanket, even if its threads were no longer held together by shared system of government. Or that insulating or extracting ourselves would simply be impossible, leaving us trapped with a foreign and security policy premised on interoperability and interchangeability with a violently unhinged autocracy. To those sceptical of the alliance or already opposed to it, the answers to these questions, and really to any alliance developments, would presumably be that Australia needs to build a more independent foreign and security policy to shore up our sovereignty, particularly in defence acquisition, or even to abandon the alliance altogether. But for the most part, and certainly for now at least, those options seem politically impossible. There's no appetite within the parties of government or in the mainstream media for even considering such options. And such calls also get unfairly trapped into binaries that dismiss the good things about the relationship, like a shared history of democratic government, of course, but more importantly, a shared history of democratic solidarity between peoples that have built international coalitions to do things like oppose apartheid, labour exploitation, racist policing, and environmental destruction. The bonds, in short, between two imperfect democracies, and not the bonds between an empire and its deputy sheriff.
Thanks for watching. Visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research, commentary and analysis, as well as details for upcoming events and webinars.